So we now transition to a panel on free data flows and global data security. We will focus on global data security in the face of geopolitical challenges. This panel features industry leaders from the NCC Group, TikTok, and Deutsche Telekom. I will briefly introduce all our panelists. Our first panelist is Jade Nestor, Director of Data Public Policy Europe at TikTok. Then next, Valentin Steinhauer, Deputy Head of Office at the EU presentation of the Deutsche Telekom. And last but not least, Stephen Bailey, Global Director of Privacy at the NCC Group. I will now give the stage to my colleague Patrick, who is going to moderate the panel. Thank you all for being here, and thank you, Patrick.
You're welcome. So, dear ladies and gentlemen, dear participants, Jade, Stephen, and Valentin, welcome to today's panel discussion titled Free Data Flows and Building Trust, Strengthening Global Data Security Amidst Geopolitical Challenges. So thank you very much for joining today. I would like to open the discussion with a first opening question to Jade. What are the key economic or geopolitical challenges related to free data flows and data protection, and why is this particularly relevant for your company?
Thank you very much, and thank you for having us, of course. So for TikTok, these are both really key objectives for us: to protect data in Europe according to the GDPR, both in the UK and the EU, but then also to have a global platform and to have global data flows. We have a global user base, we have employees around the world, so we're trying to figure out how do you lean into European data sovereignty, support a global platform, and protect European data. And so we developed something called Project Clover, which we can talk about more, which is our European data sovereignty project. And it's a 12 billion euro investment over a 10-year period. So this is not a small project, which I think shows the challenge of meeting both of these objectives of free flow of data and data protection. But for us, of course, we have a lot of scrutiny. So we're really focusing a lot of attention in this area, trying to protect data and then meet these stringent regulatory demands that we have in Europe, of course, underlined by a framework of rights.
Thank you, Jade. So Project Clover was already mentioned. That's why I'm linking it directly also to Stephen. Do you want to add something?
Hi there. Thank you for inviting me along. The only things I sort of add really on those challenges are that we see as an organization, because we help lots of organizations in a similar way that we're working with TikTok. And you know, the two main things really that most companies are struggling with is that fragmented regulatory environment. So many different countries have different cybersecurity requirements, not just at the national level, but that can push out into sectors as well. So, for example, telecoms might have its own, and energy will have its own, and that can cause difficulties. And then add on top of that, this growing sort of push towards data sovereignty, data localization, is starting to make it a little bit tricky for organizations to think about how they can get utility through sharing data without compromising any of those requirements.
Thank you, Stephen. Valentin, so why is free data flows and data protection relevant for your company, for Deutsche Telekom?
Yeah, thank you very much. To be honest, I think it's relevant to anyone, right? I mean, we wouldn't have this panel without cross-border data flows. I mean, I'm myself based in Brussels, so I'm pretty sure that we have some cross-border data flows going on right now. And of course, it's also extremely relevant for us as a company because we rely on global supply chains. We have customers that, of course, also have global operations that we try to support in this. And I would like to come back to your question about the challenge. And I think the key challenge is really trust. And I think that's also why I think the title of the panel is actually a good one, because it's really this balance between free data flows, but also with trust. And I think on the trust side, we do still see some challenges, and maybe I can briefly mention 4 challenges. I think one is that we still have a conflict of laws, which is due to different regulatory standards, different rules, which is in some parts unresolved. Second, we also see sometimes still a lack of transparency. Do we really know where our data goes, what happens to the data? Third, and I think is also an important part of the discussion, is really asymmetries also in the global data economy. So do we have a balanced flow of data globally? Is there a fair distribution of data? And last but not least, I think is also about choice in the end, because if we want to have trust in cross-border data flows, it's also essential that users, organizations, citizens have actually alternatives to choose from in order to actually have control over what happens to their data.
Thank you. So allow me, Valentin, to follow up with the question, what do you see then as the biggest obstacle to truly free and secure international data flows from your point of view?
Yeah, I think I already mentioned it. I think trust is really at the center. So without this, I think we cannot have a global framework on this, and we cannot really have an alignment. So I think this is really the first point to mention. But I think it also goes beyond trust, because ultimately it's also about security, and it's not only about personal data. I think we have moved also beyond this. If we look at the discussions that we had in Brussels, for example, with the Data Act, this is also very much about non-personal data, sensitive data, for example, industrial data, IP. So I think it's really important to get these two dimensions right, trust and security. And then I would add maybe as a third layer, and I mentioned it briefly already before, I think it's also reciprocity. So do we have reciprocal access to data? And because I think to a large extent, we're talking, especially from a European perspective, sometimes quite a lot about how we can enable data flows outside of Europe to other regions. And I think sometimes we talk a bit too little about how we can actually also ensure that data flows into Europe. And I think we need to look at both dimensions.
Yeah, thank you very much. So Jade, if you would like to follow up on this, what Valentin said, and maybe add a little bit more to what extent do you see growing geopolitical tensions between the US, China, and Europe as a threat to your global business, particularly in terms of data flow?
Great, thank you. I mean, I want to follow up on a point that Valentin made about trust, because I think that is so important. And what we've been trying to do to restore trust, I mean, I mentioned leaning into data sovereignty, but the reason that we've been working with NCC groups to bring in a layer of oversight and accountability about where our data is flowing. We have a segregated enclave for European data, which right now consists of a data center in the US, and then also an Irish data center, and then we'll be bringing one in Norway on board. And the goal is to have everything stored by default in Europe. So this has been a migration process. But then we also built these digital barriers around the data, and NCC Group is monitoring the data flows in and out, because I think part of accountability is having that demonstrable accountability, having that oversight. And so we tried to build that in to build trust, to his point. I think in terms of obstacles, though, we've been trying out this novel approach. I hope that regulators, can appreciate what we're trying to do. And so I think one of the obstacles is maybe like obstinance to some of these new approaches, or not obstinance, but maybe more like not understanding how all the components fit together. And so I think being open-minded about solutions like this, and also like privacy enhancing technologies, that's something that we're using in Project Clover as well to pseudonymize data. If regulatory acceptance of that, I think would really help us move forward. And in terms of the geopolitical tensions, I mean, I think sometimes because of TikTok and the stories about TikTok, people think of us as, like the only company that ever has any historical heritage to China, right? There are a lot of companies that are doing business with the US, with China, with countries all around the world. If you look at, for example, binding corporate rule documents of European multinational companies, they list China as recipient countries for European data. They list the US, they list all of these other countries. And so I see this global data flows issue as an industry issue. It's not just a TikTok issue, it's an industry issue. I think we all are trying to figure out how to solve the problem and how to comply with the law. But I think that at the high level, governments and regulators need to talk to each other too, to think, how can we realistically help achieve business and innovation goals, particularly in Europe, while also still adhering to our rights-based framework.
Thank you, Jade. So Stephen, Project Clover was once again mentioned, and trust as the bigger headline here. So as part of Project Clover, NCC Group independently audits TikTok's data controls and safeguards, data flows, and security protocols. So what is the rationale behind external data oversight, and how is it done to build the trust?
So what we're doing is we're looking at a number of different things, and our start point is assuring the core elements of Project Clover. So Project Clover is in effect something called the European Enclave, where all the user data for EA, UK, Swiss people will reside. And then between that and the outside are some digital barriers called security gateways that systems and people need to go through to work on the data in the European Enclave for the exchange of data for systems applications to run. So we're starting at the very kind of base level. So we've reviewed all the source code for those security gateways, and now we're into a process of reviewing any changes to those. We've looked at the end-to-end process, so to make sure that the thing that's approved and then pushed through into the live environment is the same thing and it can't be interfered with on its way and when it's in place. And then we monitor it. We monitor for changes, and we're looking for activity that's going on around that as well. So that's how we're doing it. We've assured the cloud environments that it's operating in, and so now we can see if new things are put into there or there are changes to existing things. We can see that and pick that up straight away. And that's the thing that when we meet with TikTok, with governments and data protection regulators and national cybersecurity authorities, these are the measures that we talk about that we have in place to give that confidence and trust in the fact that the data is being secured and access to it is being very tightly controlled. And we do that kind of away from anything other things that TikTok are doing.
Thank you. So going back to Valentin, so how does Telecom navigate the challenges posed by the recent EU legislation, such as the Data Act and European Cloud Certification Scheme? And what impact do these regulations have on your cloud services and data operations across Europe? And how do you ensure then to be a trustworthy company?
Yeah, I think if you look at, I mean, there's a lot to say about the recent legislations, especially the Data Act is a very complex piece of legislation. But I think if we look at what it actually changes in terms of cross-border data flows, it does two things, which we actually welcome, which is on the one hand, it brings safeguards for cloud users by making sure that there's no extraterritorial access to data stored inside of the European Union that would be unlawful or not in compliance with EU legislation. And the second one, which is I think also equally important, is transparency. It basically requires cloud providers to make transparent towards their customers where the data is actually processed, stored, and which laws apply. And I think these two steps is something that is absolutely important, because when we talk about trust, I think having that baseline transparency is the first step to get there. Second one on cloud, I think we have had a long discussion about cloud and cloud sovereignty in the European Union and different initiatives like Gaia X and others. And I think what all these initiatives and discussions boil down to is actually more or less the realization in Europe that we have a market that is largely captured by three non-European players, right? We have a dependency in the cloud market, and there's not really choice, at least not choice that is outside of the mainstream providers, let's say. And I think part of these initiatives aim to actually create that choice and to bring also, again, more transparency into the market. And I think one of the key initiatives here is this European Cloud Certification Scheme. There's been a long discussion on this. I don't want to go into the details of it, but I think it's interesting to look at certification also as an instrument to harmonize some of these requirements, right? Because we have a lot of sovereign cloud offers in the market right now, but I think the problem is that we don't really know anymore what is really a sovereign cloud, what is behind it. Some companies say that they localize data, others do other things. And there's, I think, by now a bit of a confusion around what is actually required. So I think in that sense, we would actually welcome a harmonization of some of these requirements in a certification scheme such as EUCS to also bring clarity to the market.
Thank you, Valentin. So Jade, maybe you would like to add something to that what Valentin have said, and also maybe you can give us a brief overview of how TikTok manages the challenges of complying the varying data privacy requirements across different jurisdictions, and how does this affect then TikTok in general?
Yeah, I mean, I think Valentin mentioned transparency, and I think that's something that we've been trying to focus on as well, trying to be very open with stakeholders about what we're doing with Project Clover. But then we also really started posting our thoughts about data sovereignty back in 2020 in some newsroom posts, sort of like blog posts that our users could read. So we've been trying to be very open about the strategy. And then as we work with NCC, we've been trying to think of ways that we can be more transparent. For example, listing information about the security vulnerabilities that NCC Group is finding in our transparency reporting. I don't think anyone's done that before. So we've been trying to be creative with transparency. We, for a long time, have listed where our data, user data is transferred, and that just means remote access, but where is it transferred? Other companies don't do that. We've prohibited certain employees, like employees based in China, from accessing certain types of European data, and we've been quite open about that now. So I think just telling people about the journey that we're going on and being transparent has been very helpful. In terms of all the different requirements, I mean, we're very lucky to have an excellent legal team, which identifies all of the GDPR, UK GDPR requirements, and then other global requirements. And they work very closely with our security team, which is the Global Security Organization, who also is working closely with NCC Group to build out the requirements for Project Clover. So I think all of these different components work together for us on Clover, and then also in Project Texas, which is the US version of that. So it's complicated, but there's so much internal buy-in because of the importance of this that I think it makes it all work.
Thank you. So Stephen, it was also once again mentioned that there are, of course, some technical reasons behind, and that you have to install some of those things. So how can you, from your perspective, or maybe outline something for our listeners, how you implement a robust security standards, and how you would see how it will change in the near-term future?
So as an organization generally, so NCC Group works with lots of different organizations, private and public sector, to help them with improving their security posture. And in the same way that we're doing with TikTok, it's really about ensuring that the measures that are being put in place meet the threats that organization is actually facing. And that is sort of in harmony and parallel with all of the other requirements that come in. So we've all mentioned about this fragmented sort of regulatory landscape that there is there. And it really is just about getting the basics right. So it's really understanding the data that does need to be shared, and then putting in the right technical organizational measures to make sure that data is afforded the protections it needs. And so that when you are sharing data with outside parties, whether they're across international boundaries or not, it's only the data that they need to do what they're doing. And I do think that for the future, I think that privacy enhancing technologies are really going to start to come to the fore, because I think everybody, regulators included, understands the importance of data flowing for global organizations. And it really is just about making sure that the things that can flow easily, and some of the stuff that can't flow is protected in some way, for example, through privacy enhancing technologies. And then you have a balance of utility of the data and privacy of the data. And it's that tricky balance of finding the right measure of those things.
Thank you, Valentin. So we're already covering the near-term future or the long-term vision. So how do you see the future of free data flows in light of increasing demands for data localization and national sovereignty?
Yeah, I think we need to probably differentiate a bit here, because I I would challenge, at least from a European perspective, and I think it varies a lot between different regions, and different governments have very different approaches on data flows. But I think from a European perspective, I would like to challenge a bit the notion that data flows, global data flows, is contradictory to sovereignty or notion of sovereignty. And I would not talk about national sovereignty, but more of a, in that sense, European regional sovereignty. And I think ultimately it should go hand in hand, the two of them. I would at least like to believe that it's possible to have European tech sovereignty and at the same time keep data flows being open as much as it's possible. But of course, this also means that you shouldn't be naive, I think. From a governmental point of view, it's important to enforce your laws and to maintain the protections that are necessary. And I think that always has to be balanced. And secondly, also, I think it depends on the type of data that we talk about, and also on the user requirements, frankly, because there might be some companies that are perfectly fine using, for example, a public cloud because they have global supply chains, they want to exchange some data. But I think, as Stephen mentioned, there are also other cases where companies have very sensitive data, for example, that they do not want to be on a public cloud. So currently they use maybe on-premise systems. And I think there we also need to find solutions that actually cater to their demands and their requirements. And that's, again, where I think some of the safeguards and requirements that are being discussed, for example, in Brussels, can play a role in order to help also bringing some of these more regulated and sensitive data to the cloud.
Thank you. So, Jade, also directed at your position at TikTok. So, what do you believe then for the near-term future are the most critical actions? So, both technically and also politically, must be ensured to secure those free global data flows.
I think that governments and regulators, as I mentioned, need to continue talking to each other about what demands are in place for the economy writ large. I know that that's not necessarily a data protection authority's job, but I think it's more aligned to what is realistically happening, and how can the law still work within what needs to happen at a practical level. What TikTok is doing, as I mentioned, is focused a lot on accountability. And I think maybe that's one way that we can move forward with that discussion, that oversight and accountability piece. And I think that, I truly do believe that data is going to help us solve some of the world's challenges. So we do need to figure out a way to have data flows around the world. And if we look at the Digital Europe stats that trade organization has, there's a huge amount of data flowing in and out of Europe around the world. We need to figure out how to harness that for innovation, for business, but also to solve some of these critical issues, facing us, and do it in a way that respects privacy. I don't think that stopping data flows is going to be the way forward. We have to think of ways to have accountable, safe data flows in and out of Europe.
Thank you. So, Stephen, maybe from your point of view, more focused on the technical side, so you don't have to outline a product roadmap right now, but how would you see, what kind of homework do you have to do in the near-term future to ensure those global free data flows?
I think you're on mute.
I think you're on mute, Stephen.
Apologies, I clicked the wrong thing. I think there's two things. What I'd like to see is on the sort of the political, the cooperative level, greater cooperation between countries around cybersecurity and what the best level should look like and what the normal level that most organizations can operate at. So if you're a small boutique organization and you're just posting your products out to people, you don't need to have the same controls in place as a bank, for example, or a pharmaceutical company. So I think we need a lot more cooperation on that, just to try and cut down the vast array of different frameworks that there are for cybersecurity and privacy as well. And I think the other thing is just helping to get the privacy-enhancing technologies to the point where they become a bit more mainstream, they're a bit more usable, kind of straight off the shelf for organizations, because I think it's still a and developing thing, and there are very few organizations using it very much. Certainly TikTok are using it at scale, which brings along its own challenges. But I think they're the two key things that we need for the near term.
So thank you very much, Jade, Valentin, and Stephen, for today's panel discussion. And your point of view on how to secure those free data flows and how essential they are and will be. So it's definitely, I can definitely conclude that from your point of views that, of course, the geopolitical tensions and the fragmented regulations pose significant challenges to those free global data flows, but they are important and they must be secured. And it was definitely, or it became clear definitely that trust and transparency are critical to maintaining those global data flows, and that you're willing, of course, to make sure, to ensure that those trust and transparency goals are reached. And as pointed out from a technical position as well, there are a range of solutions already on the market, and that you make sure with your companies as well to be on point and to, of course, move on and to reach the milestones in a product roadmap to make that happen. So thank you very much once again, Jade, Valentin, and Stephen, for having your views on this panel. And now I would like to hand over to Emily Hancock,